Happy Friday morning, everyone. Welcome to the last Friday in February as we near the end of meteorological winter in Wisconsin. Meteorological spring starts on Monday, which also means we can park on our side of 45th Street again. Over the past few weeks, we had two great programs on owls and bird eruptions. We celebrated the Lunar New Year, Mardi Gras, Ash Wednesday, Valentine's Day. The Cardinals are singing like crazy. And again, maybe some of you got a chance to look for some snow fleas with the warming temperatures. I'm excited to talk today about a plant that is very near and dear to my heart, the sugar maple. Our family probably goes through a gallon of maple syrup maybe every 4 months or so. I have a little bit in my coffee right now, and it's liquid gold in this house. Side note, if you haven't watched the film Searching for Sugar Man, it really is worth the watch, in my opinion. This very unique and uplifting documentary. And there's some great new content on our parent website, UEC in My Backyard. Matt Flower posted his second Nature's Mystery Theater audio drama for kids called The Celebration Allegation. These are great ways to grab the attention of kids and adults, get them off screens and onto the living room floor like they should be to listen to a nature-themed mystery by the extremely talented Matt Flower before bedtime. There's also a Chad the Nature Dad episode on animal tracks in the snow. There's a nice blog on winter owls written by communications intern Ellie Rickman. And there's a story with Tori where she reads from local author Lois Ellert. The book, the words, the illustrations, and the image of Tori reading in the snow are all visually stunning. We're going to switch gears just a bit and start the program with a statement from Urban Ecology Center staff. And I'm going to do that now.
Hello, Urban Ecology Center community. My name is Ken Leinbach, the Executive Director of the Urban Ecology Center. Today, we would like to share with you...
It's pretty quiet right now.
Oh, I apologize. Let me just check one thing. You weren't hearing Ken?
No.
Let me just try this one more time. I think I might have... Yes, that is what I did wrong. All right, I'll try this again. Apologies. Okay. Take two here. Is that better?
Yes. I think.
Hello, Urban Ecology Center community. My name is Ken Leinbach, the Executive Director of the Urban Ecology Center. Today, we would like to share with you our anti-racism statement prepared by members of our Urban Ecology Center staff. Our Equity, Dignity, and Justice Committee has been laying the groundwork for this statement for the last couple of years. And today, we're excited to share with you our Equity, Dignity, and Justice anti-racism action statement with you and with everyone else in the community.
There's an incredible underrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the environmental field.
At the Urban Ecology Center, we believe that this reality of exclusion is racist and needs to change.
As we work toward change going forward, we must acknowledge the historical trauma caused by centuries of land theft, enslavement, lynchings, and segregation.
Furthermore, the environmental field continues to exclude, misrepresent, and silence Black, Indigenous, and people of color's voices.
We strive to disrupt these patterns of injustice alongside many others in our field.
Our mission is to connect people in cities to nature and each other.
To carry out this mission, we must confront the ways in which white supremacy and systemic racism disconnect people from nature and each other.
We actively work to preserve and celebrate the simple human right to be outside.
The Urban Ecology Center is committed to nurturing and maintaining a culture of dignity, equity, and justice.
We want our staff, board, volunteers, and relationships with community partners to reflect the diverse communities that we serve, and for all experiences, backgrounds, and identities to be honored.
However, as an environmental organization with predominantly white staff and leadership, we know we have work to do.
This work includes investing time and energy to uncover how white supremacy and systemic racism are part of this organization and how we work to remove them.
We are committing to actively working toward these goals in 2021 and beyond.
1. Increase the number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our organization's leadership, staff, board, volunteers, and community partners.
2. Ensure that anti-racism is an integral part of our work as we advance our mission of connecting people in cities to nature and each other.
3. Explore the historical roots of white supremacy in the environmental movement and dismantle them within our organization.
4. Shift decision-making power within the organization to amplify Black, Indigenous, and people of color's voices.
We know that a commitment is only a starting point. There is a lot of work left to do.
As we look forward to putting these words into action, we invite you along on the journey with us.
We hope you'll join us in learning, unlearning, and building a culture of equity, dignity, and justice while connecting with nature.
So one of the many reasons why this statement is necessary, and you may be wondering why, you tuned in for Backyard Naturalist, and we start off with this, is that we're the Urban Ecology Center, and we're known in the community as a resource for ecological issues. And I think most people associate the UEC with urban wildlife and environmental education, but we are intricately tied with the social issues in our communities. We're not generally known as a community resource for social issues, but ecological issues inform social issues, and social issues inform ecological issues. To help make the necessary changes to a just and equitable community, we need to recognize the forces in our community that are contributing to injustices, including and especially ourselves, and take action to dismantle them. For me, and particular for the series, this means facing centuries of lies, misinformation, and inequities in the environmental world, and the great lengths we've gone through to perpetuate them. So I recognize this as someone who's telling stories today, and my commitment is to try and dismantle and disentangle the colonial roots of our knowledge and find a more complete and truthful narrative. And I invite you all to take this journey with me. Last week, Tori introduced me to this book. Plants Have So Much to Give Us, All We Have to Do Is Ask. Anishinaabe Botanical Teachings by Mary Sissop Genius. In this book, Genius recounts teachings from an Anishinaabe Ojibwe medicine woman, Kiwaitanokwe, or the Woman of the Northwest Wind, who was a professor at UW-Milwaukee in the 1980s. And Genius's daughter, Wendy McCoon's Genius, also wrote a book called Our Knowledge Is Not Primitive. And you've probably picked up on the theme in this series, in this Backyard Naturalist series, highlighted by you all who join as participants, that there have been groups of people that have never been taken seriously by Western science, and ways of thinking that have been ignored to their own detriment, really. And Genius stresses the need to look at how colonization has negatively impacted our knowledge and ourselves through these dismissals. Many of us looked at indigenous nations through this noble savage lens that we were constantly exposed to in school and in the media. And this had the effect of really removing the need for a better understanding of how knowledge is gained and passed. Stories are often dismissed as fairy tales rather than a living method of documenting, storing, and passing on knowledge and experiences. But stories evolve with our knowledge and strengthen our understanding of the world. In addition to these books, I referenced Danny Pirtle's great encyclopedia podcast and an episode with AJ Bach, who is not only a maple syrup expert, but she's also a singer. And one of her most popular requests is a song that she wrote about maple syrup. And I also referenced the great tree books that I've mentioned in the Fur Crazy episodes, as well as Mental Floss. So today's stories are about a type of tree. And I've learned from respected teachers the importance of using the same filter to talk about trees and other plants and animals as we use for humans. Robin Wall Kimmerer taught a tree is not an it, and we should use pronouns that reflect that. And she suggests replacing the word it when talking about a tree or another plant and replacing it with kin. And Robin has many wonderful talks you can find online, including a TED Talk. And when Tori introduced me to Genius, she also suggested following this Anishinaabe idea that we learn best when we use all our senses. So again, we encourage you to have some maple syrup this morning in your coffee or in your pancakes, or I just like it on a teaspoon, pure and delicious. So to help us learn a little bit more intimately about maple trees and maple syrup. And Anishinaabe and other teachings stress the importance of giving thanks to the being who made the sacrifice to give you sustenance, and if you can, to ask permission. So this might be a little harder for us to do today, but if you do regularly use maple syrup and you don't tap your own trees, you could find a local source and see if you could visit the land and the trees that provide you with syrup. And here in the Milwaukee area, we are on traditional Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Potawatomi homeland, and we're the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. What we call sugar maple, the Anishinaabe call Ininatig, is a flowering tree or an angiosperm. And we talk about how flowering trees fit in our classification system in the oak tree episode from season 1. Oak trees are in the order Fagales, and sugar maples are in the order Sapindales, which includes well-known trees like citrus, mangoes, one of my favorites, the cashew, with its accompanying marañon's fruit. Frankincense and myrrh both come from resin from trees in this group, as well as mahogany and neem. As a whole, this group is named for its milky sap, and chemicals in this sap can often be harmful to us. They can cause strong allergic reactions or worse. The cashew nut is extremely toxic before it's processed, and I know several folks who react pretty strongly to mango. Maple trees are further grouped into the Sapindaceae, or the soapberry family, again named for that milky sap, along with horse chestnuts, liches, ackee, and rambutans. I mentioned the UEC is hoping to go back to Costa Rica in the summer of 2022. And if any of you can join me, I will buy you all of the mamonchino you can eat, and I can eat 1,000,000. And the fruits of these soapberries tend to have a flavor that people either love or hate. Sometimes they're very strong. And again, this probably has to do with that milky, soapy sap that often has those toxins that are sometimes taken up by the plant, kind of like the fugu fish of the fruit world, but not mamonchinos. Those are simply and objectively delicious. There are about 1,600 species of plants in the soapberry family. And then the maple trees are further divided into the genus Acer, the maples. We have about 128 species of maples. Most are native to Asia. And surprisingly, only one of those 128 species cross the equator into the southern hemisphere. They're mainly climax species in old growth forest, prized for the hardwood. We use them for aging liquor, and then of course their sap. In general, maple leaves have that characteristic palmate shape, like the palm of a hand, with the fingers spreading away from the stem. There's one notable exception to that palmate leaf shape, the common box elder, which is the only maple with a compound pinnate leaf. Compound because one leaf has a series of separate leaflets coming bilaterally off that main stem. In fact, one common name for the box elder is the ash-leaved maple, because the leaf resembles an ash leaf. And I'm often asked if box elders are exotic species. They are not. They're a good example of what we call a native but weedy species. So they're native, but they're good at colonizing and spreading in disturbed areas. So we kind of think of them as a weedy tree. Another way to recognize maples is that they have opposite branching, meaning leaves and branches branch off of a stem at the same point, as opposed to trees with alternate branching, where leaves and twigs branch off at different points along the stem. One quick and easy way to remember which trees and shrubs have opposite branching patterns is the acronym MAD-CAP horse. MAD stands for maple, ash, and dogwood. CAP is for Caprifoliaceae, or the honeysuckle family. It just rolls off the tongue, Caprifoliaceae, and that includes things like nannyberry and highbush cranberry. And then the horse stands for horse chestnut, which is very closely related to the maples. Some people will simplify it further by using the acronym BAM for box elder, ash, and maple, but we all know that box elder is a type of maple, so it's a little redundant. Another very cool characteristic of maples is the winged fruit, or the samaras. Technically, samaras are winged achenes. And I did not know what an achene was, but an achene is a type of fruit in which the seed takes up almost all of the space in the fruit, and then it's surrounded by usually a very thin outer layer called the pericarp. And if you go back to the pumpkin episode, we talk all about the layers of fruit. But unlike many fruits that have those fleshy layers like apples and pears and watermelons and green peppers, achenes are pretty much the seed and then an outer layer. And another good example of an achene is a strawberry, which is a collection of achenes, those tiny seeds on the surface of the strawberries. Those are the fruits, the achenes, and they're essentially a seed surrounded by a very thin external layer, and that attaches the seeds to that sweet red accessory tissue that makes the strawberry so delicious. So the actual fruit of the strawberry has virtually no flavor, but we love to eat the tissue that the fruit is attached to, which is not the fruit, which is different from, say, a pear. In a pear, the delicious part is the layer of the fruit. So next time you're eating a strawberry, just take a close look at that surface and look for those mini pears or those mini achenes. Other trees will also produce winged achenes like elms and hop trees, but the seeds in samaras are asymmetrical. That's important. So the seed is on one side, and then that rigid external layer extends out to the other side, which causes the samara to rotate as it falls. That allows the seed to disperse farther away from the parent tree by riding air currents. But we all know that the real function of those rotating samaras is that we can pick them up and throw them in the air and watch the little helicopters in action. In fact, the US Army also experimented with this specific design, looking at if they could throw supplies from airplanes that would get to the ground quicker than a parachute, but less impact than if they simply dropped them. And I don't think those designs ever panned out, but they experimented dropping like 60 or 70 pounds of materials with that rotating action, using the samara as the kind of framework for it. The Latin name for sugar maple is Acer saccharum, not to be confused with the silver maple, which is Acer saccharinum. The sugar maple is also called rock maple, bird eye maple, sweet maple, curly maple, hard maple, and sugar tree in English. In Anishinaabe, kin is known as Ininatig. And I think the first thing most of us associate with the sugar maple is the syrup, but they're also prized for their beautiful fall colors produced by the leaves, and the variation between trees and even within the same tree of maple it can be stunning, from the yellows to the reds to the purples. And you'll often see several different colors even on the same tree. We also know them for their hardwood and the shade that these majestic and stately trees provide. And they can reach heights of 100 to even 150 feet. It's primarily a tree of the northeastern part of the US and into northern Canada, and much more common in the cooler parts of the range, Canada, the upper Midwest, and New England, because they require a hard freeze each winter for proper dormancy, or that sleeping, resting period that Caitlin mentioned a couple months ago that I just love. And they also need a hard freeze for effective seed germination. So they're much less common in the South, and when they are in the South, you usually see them in cooler valleys or mountains. We'll get to the syrup eventually, but maple has a ton of other uses that makes it highly sought after, starting with the popular pastime of bowling, where maple provides wood for both the lane itself and the pins, where you need an extremely durable wood that just takes a massive beating over and over and over and over again, both the floor and the pins. Maple is the floor of choice for many NBA teams. Maple is sought after for baseball bats, maple and ash, but now with the decline in ash, maple is becoming kind of the standard. It's used in high-end pool cues and in cutting boards, especially when it has a unique bird's eye pattern. Maple is used in instruments, from violins to pianos and drums to guitars, both acoustic and electric. But all of these are really side gigs to the main purpose of maple tree, which is to make yummy golden syrup. And we'll begin with the story of Nana Bojo and the maple trees. Nana Bojo is a spirit and a trickster that figures prominently in the stories of the world's creations among Anishinaabe cultures. The story of Nana Bojo and maples differs slightly depending on the storyteller, but we're going to read from Genius's book, Plants Have So Much to Give Us. All we have to do is ask. And this is actually called the birch tree, the maple tree, and Nana Bojo. But in the interest of time today, I'm going to focus on the parts of the story related to the maple tree. So for the full story, I encourage you to find a copy of the book. And here we go. One time, Nana Bojo was walking along the shore when he started to feel hungry. So he decided to see if he could find something to eat. He went up to an Inanatig, the sugar maple tree, and said, "Anin, hello, brother. Can you tell me why you were created? Of what use are you to my kind?" The Inanatig replied, "Oh, Nana Bojo, Anin, you ask why was I created? Well, I don't think you would understand if I did tell you." "Of course I would," Nana Bojo insisted. "I have been to a lot of places and I understand a lot of very complicated things about the world. I am sure I would understand you." After he coaxed the tree for some time, the Inanatig finally said, "I have a food gift for our little brothers, the Anishinaabe. In the early spring, like now, when the days are warm and the nights are cold, I have wonderful sweet syrup that flows out of my bark." "Good," said Nana Bojo. "I am hungry. I think I will test you to see if you are telling the truth." He cut a piece of bark from a wigwasi mitig, or paper birch, and fashioned it into a makak, birch bark container. Then he bored a hole in the Inanatig and caught the thick syrup that flowed out of the bark. He tasted it, and it was really very good. So he drank and drank and drank the syrup until he could hold no more. But then he started to feel rather sick to his stomach, for he had eaten far too much of the sweet syrup. He sat down under the trees and groaned for a while. Then he started to get angry. "You tricked me," he screamed. "You knew that I would feel like this, but you did not bother to warn me. Inanatig, you are just too dangerous for my poor nephews, the Anishinaabe, as you are now, but I will fix that." So Nana Bojo ran down to the river and he scooped up a makak full of water. He raced back up the hill, climbed the Inanatig, drilled a big hole in the trunk, and poured in the water. He kept pouring makak after makak full of water into the poor Inanatig until the sap that ran from the bark had only a very faint taste of maple syrup. "There," said Nana Bojo, "that will take care of that problem. My nephews will not be tempted to eat so much of you that they become sick if they have to work hard boiling your sap down to make syrup." So that is why the maple sap is so diluted, and we'll follow that up with a very quick video on the traditional Anishinaabe way of harvesting syrup from maple trees.
My name is Caleb Musgrave from Hiawatha First Nation. I'm Mississauga Anishinaabe, or Anishinaabe, and we're working in the sugar bush, making maple sugar.
So what do you look for in a tree? Why is this a good tree?
The sugar maples have a higher content of sugar, hence the name sugar maple, but at the end of the day, a maple is a maple. You can do it with a box elder. I'm not too particular on that so much as the size. So I wanted about almost as big as this tapping mallet. That one's pretty close. Too skinny and you're going to start bleeding the tree dry. This is a flat cedar spile, and it's the traditional way for guiding the sap from the tap down to your bucket. If it's a straight grain cedar, you can go real quick, go steady. It smells real nice when you do that too. And then you just square it off, take off that bark. You can make it that long if you have to, but I usually keep them a little under a foot. So about that distance. Make it once there, make it there, break it off, and then measure it off to my tapping wedge. This is what I used to actually make the holes in the tree. Just like that. Again, I'm not seeing any sap flowing quite yet, but it will start to flow like the others. I'll just set that in there. Give it a few light taps just to help hold it on. This is a tap we did 2 days ago, and it's been slowly filtering in. It's still getting really cold at night, and even during the daytime it was about -8 this morning around 9 a.m. So this is all pure sap. This is all just pure sap coming down the slat and dripping down. There's more going down, but my nephews wanted to have something to chew on while they're out here, so they broke off the icicles and ate them. We got some in the bucket down there, frozen in with a little bit of sap, and you can still see drips coming down as the day's been warming up. And then every day we come out and collect that sap, and we just continue to boil it down and boil it down. What we do is we traditionally pour it either into molds of basswood that are carved out to be candies, or we pour them into birch bark cones like this. And there's a knot in the bottom, and all the sugar kind of glues and bonds and welds to that so it can't fall out. And this is how we carry it. That way you can hang it and it's not going to fall out. Mice can't climb up and get into it. Rain will drip down the sides. You have bundles of like 20 or 50 of these for trading, and that was how we used to use it as a barter. So all you do is just set it up like that. You'd have many of them lined up if you had enough of them. You just pour them in, let them cool. It takes about 10 minutes for them to cool, and then you can hang it up. If you think about it, everybody just thinks about the sugar that comes out of this, the type of sucrose or glucose sugar that comes out of it. But there's also all the vitamins, all the minerals, the nutritional fiber and stuff that's in that sap that's being concentrated as well. A lot of people that make traditional medicines will actually use maple syrup as an additive.
Right. So about that syrup, and much of the following content will be coming to you from the good folks at Mental Floss and Encyclopedia. But after the stunt that Nana Bojo pulled, the fresh maple sap straight from the tree has a very low sugar content with about 2% sugar, which on one hand seems really low, 2%, but for a tree that is really, really high. And that's, one of the reasons why maple trees are tapped. Other trees that we can tap will have maybe 0.5 to 1% of syrup. And in many places around the world, it's the sap is sought after. It can quench your thirst. It's kind of the original vitamin water, and in parts of Korea, locals prefer to drink the sap straight from the tree, and they can drink in huge quantities at a time. But most places prefer the syrup form. And you've probably heard that it takes on average 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. A single tree usually yields between 5 to 15 gallons of sap per season. So a productive tree can give you about 1 liter of syrup. And then you have the products that I grew up thinking was maple syrup, the Hungry Jack and the Log Cabin and others, which do carry the label of syrup, but there's not a shred of maple inside them. They're mostly composed of such wholesome ingredients as cellulose gum and high fructose corn syrup and caramel coloring. So they can't technically be labeled maple syrup, which is why we see them marketed as pancake syrup or breakfast syrup or original syrup. And I always feel so snobby when I ask in a restaurant, what kind of syrup are you going to give me? Is it going to be maple syrup and the people I'm eating with usually roll their eyes, but I just want to know if it's going to be real maple syrup. There is an International Maple Syrup Institute founded in 1975 to promote and protect pure maple syrup and other maple syrup products. There are, of course, many types and hues of maple syrup, even though they all have the same single ingredient. In our grocery stores, we tend to find either grade A syrup, which is produced earlier in the season and is processed faster at higher heat. So grade A is lighter in both color and flavor and tends to be preferred, at least here in the States, probably because it more resembles those syrup imposters that we grew up with, like Log Cabin It does have fewer of the healthy minerals that Caleb mentioned in the video because more of them burn off at higher heat. And then we can also find grade B maple syrup, which is produced later in the season and requires a little more technical skill from what I understand, unless everything is automated, but it's processed at lower heats and for longer times, and leaves a little bit less room for error. And it's my preferred syrup. It has a much more robust maple flavor. The ingredients are caramelized, kind of like onions. When you cook onions longer at low heat, they get caramelized. And it's the same with the sugars and minerals in the syrup. So it's also higher in vitamin and mineral content because fewer of those ingredients are burned off. But for some, that flavor is just a little too much. And so grade B is used primarily for baking rather than on pancakes. But all types of maple have the same exact ingredient and the same sugar content. And of course, Vermont, because it's Vermont, follows Canada's lead because they're Canada. And both of those places break their maple syrup down into 4 categories, and using words and categories like golden and amber and dark and very dark. And I think that's also becoming more common here in the States, but you still tend to see just those 2 grades in the grocery stores. And both of those places, Canada and Vermont, lead to some interesting maple stories. So starting with our neighbors to the north, Canada now produces about 80% of the world's maple syrup, and most of that is produced in Quebec. They took over an industry that was once dominated by the United States. And I guess that probably makes sense since they have this generic maple leaf on their flag and a hockey team called the Maple Leafs. So they take their maple syrup very seriously, which may be why one of the biggest stories ever to come out of Canada was the Great Maple Syrup Heist. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers maintains a high security stockpile of maple syrup reserves that can be redistributed during lean production years, just as many countries maintain reserves of oil. But in 2012, employees at the facility pulled a Breaking Bad style heist of 6 million pounds of syrup worth almost $20 million. And they would slowly siphon off portions of syrup from each barrel and replace the syrup with water, just enough so that people wouldn't notice. And then they sold the siphoned off syrup to markets in the US, which is one of the places where there really is a black market for maple syrup because it is more costly than even crude oil. And authorities finally found out about it and launched a huge investigation. There have been 23 arrests in conjunction with the case, leading to some serious jail time. But only about 4 million pounds of the syrup was ever recovered. And like any good cartel heist story, the main ringleader apparently still is at large. And we'll be able to learn more about this because there is a movie called The Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist that is currently in production. And then heading over to Vermont, that rural, traditional, bucolic place where maple trees are tapped in the old-fashioned way. Let's take a little video produced by Science Friday.
For Craig Heaney of the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, the annual ritual of tapping maple trees to produce syrup gets kind of sappy.
I guess I was 18 years old when I started, and part of the charm for me was collecting 1,200 buckets on snowshoes. I find it really magical because it's just such a great time of year.
With the end of winter, as temperatures begin to rise above freezing, there's an eager anticipation for the first harvest of the year.
If you've gone through a long winter, it's just like, all right, there's hope, you know, it's like, it's going to taste pretty damn sweet at the end, you know.
Maple tappers wait for the conditions to be just right in order for the tree's sap to begin flowing.
Say you get a freezing night, it creates negative pressure in the tree. The roots will actually bring in more water at that point.
The following day, if the temperature rises above freezing,
the carbon dioxide in there will start to expand. It becomes positive pressure. It goes from sort of drawing up some water to then releasing it. And if you've put a small hole, pressure will be relieved, sap will flow out the tap hole.
And hopefully fill a conveniently placed bucket. Repeat this process throughout your sugar bush, which is neither sugar nor a bush, discuss among yourselves, and you should have gallons of sap.
It's mostly water, it's about 98% water, but it's got some sucrose in it.
and this would make for some really soggy, bland waffles. To get syrup, you'll need a little bit of basic chemistry. Dr. Abby Vandenberg of the University of Vermont's Proctor Maple Research Center explains.
Simply need to concentrate that sap from 2% sugar, which is how it comes out of the tree, up to syrup density, which is about 67 or 66% sugar. And the traditional way to accomplish that is through heat-driven evaporation.
The sap is run through a series of pans, which not only boil off the water, but provide the syrup's trademark flavor.
Most of the flavor that develops in maple syrup develops as that sap is processed into syrup using heat in the evaporator. Things develop like sugar degradation products and Maillard reaction products,
which also provides the syrup with its varying hues of amber and caramel. The final product is filtered, bottled, and sold with old-timey depictions of horses and sleighs and log cabins to give you that syrupy sense of nostalgia. But there's just one sticking point with this pastoral image.
Commercial maple syrup producer would be putting taps up with tubing. Basically it looks like little tributaries, and they would either be gravity fed to a collection barrel, or if it was in a flat area they would actually use a vacuum system.
A vast number of the maple operations are using tubing and vacuum sap collection and things that also might not quite fit with that sort of bucolic rural image.
And if plastic and pumps shatter your expectations, then you'll probably think the research of Dr. Vandenberg and her colleague Dr. Perkins is syrup sacrilege. In their experiments, they draw sap from juvenile trees.
And collecting it by excising or cutting off the top portion of the tree and collecting it directly from the surface of the cut stem.
It sounds extreme, lopping off the top of a sapling and sucking out its juices through a vacuum tube. But this method is not as harmful as it looks.
The tree does not die. The tree actually will resprout, and actually quite vigorously so. It'll resprout from dormant buds in the stem the following growing seasons. You can use these trees year after year. In a single-stemmed individual, you make cuts progressively further down the stem. In a multiple-stem tree, you can move from stem to stem to stem,
where you actually draw sap from the intact side of the tree.
The yields from these small trees are very, very low compared to a traditional 12-inch tree. The difference comes in when you look at it sort of on a land use area basis.
Using this method, they estimate you can get 5 to 6 times more sap than the traditional tapping of older and larger trees.
This method certainly isn't designed to supplant or replace the existing system of maple syrup production. We envision this as a way for producers to use potentially open land that they already had near their operations, an acre or 2 or 3. They could then use this technique to help increase production of their operations without having to invest a large amount of capital into forested land.
But if you're a purist, you have some time to get used to this idea. For one,
this is a really early stage in research, and we wouldn't expect it to be commercially available in the very near future.
And even then, you'd have to wait 7 to 10 years before your saplings were big enough to harvest. In the meantime, if you want to keep that warm, fuzzy feeling going, remember that maple syrup is supposed to be sappy, not corny.
A huge faux pas would be using a table syrup that you buy that's made predominantly with high fructose corn syrup and some flavoring.
Even in a dire strait, I would rather just have a pancake at a diner with some butter.
Think this technique will revolutionize how we produce maple syrup? Head over to sciencefriday.com and tell us what you think.
So I don't know if that'll change how you feel about maple syrup production in Vermont, but on the flip side of this, to kind of protect their name, Vermont successfully sued McDonald's over a menu item that was billed as fruit and maple oatmeal, because in some parts of the state, it is illegal to even use the word maple if the product isn't 100% pure maple. So as part of the settlement, in some Vermont McDonald's, patrons were offered the choice to put sugar or real syrup on their oatmeal. So before we wrap up, I'd like to say that one of my favorite parts of our knowledge of why taps work and the physiology of the trees that allow for taps to work is that we still don't have a complete explanation for how it works. We know to tap in the spring when daytime temperatures rise above freezing and nighttime temperatures drop below freezing, which is right now. And Tori said the sap's running now. We know that one of the characteristics of trees that can be tapped, like maples and birches, as opposed to oak trees, which can't, is that there are intermittent pockets of air in the xylem. And, you know, Caitlin taught us about how trees do things to avoid those gas pockets, but because they need that capillary flow to get the sap, to get the xylem or the fluids up. But apparently these gas pockets in the xylem of maples, in concert with that freezing and thawing, leads to pressure changes in the air pockets. And then when you tap into it, the pressure change forces the sap out. Kind of like my tire pressure indicator lights up every winter when the air goes below freezing. And so those air pockets expand during the day and contract at night. And that's what causes the holes in the tree. But to the best of my knowledge, we're still not 100%. We don't really understand 100% the physics behind it and physiologically why it works. So unless someone has recently figured something out, I'm not aware of it. And we're not the only creatures that are attracted to maple sap. Yellow-bellied sap suckers have been making taps for thousands and thousands of years, ingesting both the sap itself and the insects attracted to it. And squirrels can also be seen gnawing on the ends of small maple twigs, presumably to get the flowing sap. And kids are attracted to the flow straight from maple trees. And I'm going to invite Tori to turn on her microphone. And I know she has to run really quickly, but maybe she can kind of take us through these slides here.
Yeah, so I have the lucky gift that I get to tap maple trees as part of my job. And thankfully, I've learned a lot about this process. I got to take a class at UWM with Mary Sap Genius, who is just really incredible. Yeah, whoa, wait, they went away.
Oh, sorry.
So this is pictures of two staff kiddos. The one on the left is Raja, and the one on the right is Auden, and they belong to two staffers of the Urban Ecology Center. But one of kids' favorite things to do is just to sit there under the taps and let that sweet sap drip into their mouth, which is super fun. I also enjoy this. I don't know what Tim's slides are, but I do know that the next one shows some sap filling up. Depending on how warm the day is, you might get just that little amount in a day if it's not very, if the temperature swing isn't very warm, or the one on the far right is I let it go over a weekend, and that's what I came back to on a Monday after the sap had been flowing warm. These are some shots of making sap. Last year at Riverside Park, we have an evaporator, which is just a really big flat pan, and we start a fire underneath, boil the snot out of it for, I don't know, about 6 or 7 hours outside, and then bring it in and finish it up indoors. And so this is some shots of our sap production last year. These are pictures of the grade A, the first run. It's a little lighter in color than what we do later, but I don't follow the cool temperature, hot temperature. I just make a fire and let it go. And these are some of my high school students. Last year, one of the last classes we got to teach, and we brought all the stuff out, and they made pancakes for each other and collected the sap and helped us boil it down. So we try to involve students in the process along the way.
Thank you, Tori. So we'll end today with, besides the mystery of sap flow, there's also magic in the fall colors of maple trees that'll provide the basis for a future episode. But the reality is I'm perfectly fine just sticking with the magic and the beauty for now. And I'll end with the words of Donald Culross Peaty. The most magnificent display of color in all the kingdom of plants is the autumnal foliage of the trees in North America. Over them all, flames of sumac and the hellfire flickerings of poison ivy the war paint of the many oaks rise the colors of one tree, the sugar maple, in the shout of a great army. Clearest yellow, richest crimson, tumultuous scarlet, or brilliant orange, the yellow pigments shining through the overpainting of the red, the foliage of sugar maple at once outdoes and unifies the rest. It is like the mighty marching melody that rides upon the crest of some symphonic weltering sea, and with its crying song gives meaning to all the calculated dissonance of the orchestra.